Well, Mario, we finally made it to the final Donkey Kong arcade game of this whole entire trilogy, and that's what appears to be Donkey Kong 3. Now, this game in particular is extremely obscure, which we'll explain more about that if we somehow get this started. So, greetings, ladies and gentlemen, it is I am the one and only Sonic the Hedgehog here, aka the Blue Blur, aka Blue Justice. It is I am the one and only Mario here, and we are back for the likes of the Maxi Toys videos. And as I mentioned this earlier, we're about to be doing with the final Donkey Kong arcade game, not just by the forms of the arcade version, but it also applies with the NES version as well. And today, we're about to jump right into Donkey Kong 3. Now, this particular game first came out in 1983, which is roughly the exact same year as in not only for the sake of the films of the James Bond movie Octopussy came out, but it's also worth noting for is about the fact that that was the year when the video game crashed during the films of that particular year in mind. So, I'm sure that somebody else has already explained about this particular documentary, about the films of the video game crash during the films of in 1983. So, obviously, just like the forms of how it does it in Donkey Kong as well as Donkey Kong Jr., we're going to be starting things off with the arcade version, and after that, we'll play through the NES version. So because of that though, now as far as you can definitely tell right from the start though, is that the actual time length for this video is actually a lot shorter compared to the forms of how it does it on not only Donkey Kong, but also with Donkey Kong Jr. as well. The reason being for this is because, as you can see, that the entire gameplay aspect of Donkey Kong 3 plays a lot differently compared to the previous two games, because as you can tell, about the fact that we still have to deal with Donkey Kong, of course, except this time, we are able to actually take control of a different character, which is to be more specifically, the most forgotten character throughout the majority of the forms of the Nintendo video games. And that's what appears to be Stanley, which it appears to be is like Mario's cousin or something. Well, it's hard for me to say about that because, well, suffice to say, I've never actually played as Stanley before. So as a result, the main objective in this game in particular is that you have to be able to use a bug spray in order to be able to get rid of those pesky flies, and you are able to actually add up some scores. So, and every once in a while, in order to be able to actually, you know, proceed to, like, let's just say, this game in particular does have only 3 stages, so yeah, can you tell why? About the fact that this video is extremely short. So, as a result, it's Mario's turn to start with. Journey involves a bit once again the arcade version. So as you can see, that in order to able to actually go from one elevation to the other, it's I have to press the directional pad up or down depending on the forms of the actual specific perspective I have to deal with right here. So because of that though, so of course, if you couldn't tell, as soon as you're able to keep on spraying at Donkey Kong, basically we can able to proceed to the next stage. So, and as I mentioned this before, there's only 3 stages in this whole entire game. It doesn't really matter if it's either on the arcade version or the NES version. So because of that though, yeah, it looks like that Mario is actually continuously trying to mash not only the A button, but also the B button as well. And of course, just like last time, that if you get hit just once, you die. So because of that though, it is also worth noting for too, Sonic, is that, as you can see, there is actually not 1, but 5 different plants that we need to look after, because if you basically just manage to able to let those flies take all 5 of those specific plants, basically though, I believe you also die. So because of that though, it seems to be more specifically though, my run-through of Donkey Kong 3 is pretty rough though, specifically in the arcade version, because as I can definitely tell, Donkey Kong for some reason decides to able to kick my butt, no problem, during the forms within the second stage, so I was not hesitating for that. So, yeah, as far as I'm aware, my run is pretty much rough. So because of that though, at least I somehow managed able to get into the number 1 spot at the very least, well at least for now anyway. So, relatively speaking though, Sonic, it's now your turn to able to actually deal with the arcade version of Donkey Kong 3. Even though, despite the fact that, Mario, you only have to put in your 3-letter word as opposed to the actual full name. So, as a result, you're just going for Mar, stands for Mario, which I'm almost assuming you're able to type in MTP, stands for Mario the Plumber, but as a result, it might be felt a bit weird. So, either way, now it's my turn to able to play through the arcade version of Donkey Kong 3. So, no matter what though, I have to be very cautious to able to not only do not touch the forms of those pesky flies, but it's also about the fact that we need to look after the forms of those plants as well. Because as you can see, since I did somehow look after every single plant in stage 1, that way it gives me extra amounts of points. So, and there we go, I finally managed to accomplish stage 2. So that means I somehow defeat Donkey Kong at the very least though. Well, at least if I was assuming so anyway, because just like the forms of how it does it in Donkey Kong, as well as Donkey Kong Jr., obviously though we have to go through a bit of a loop again. So because of that though, except the fact that this particular game is extremely short compared to the forms of how it does on the previous 2 games, like I said this earlier. So I'm sure there might be a possibility that we might able to actually see. Oh my god! I was not expecting for that particular gruesome death, particularly for Stanley himself. Like, something tells me, if you do die at one point, like if you get stung by a fly or a pesky insect or something, basically what happens was, in the arcade version, if you do die at one point, basically the whole group of those flies will attempt to try to get to you. And guess what? You will get a gruesome death animation or something. So it's hard to explain really, which that probably explains why though, Sonic, is that unlike the NES version, where basically that particular death scene has been removed, mainly because no kids out there wants to see that gruesome death ever. So yeah, kind of thinking about it, it does kind of remind me of the forms of similar vibes, as in, do you remember that particular ending in A Bug's Life, where basically Hopper just comes across into that, the most gruesome death ever? Like, obviously he just got eaten by not only those baby birds, but also the mother of birds. So, yeah, that is seriously the most gruesome death in any of the Pixar films to date. So, anyway, so it looks like that once again Sonic just somehow beats me for the sake of the forms of the high scores and everything else like that. So, yeah, it seems to me more specifically though, Mario, is that I'm doing really good when it comes to playing arcade versions of certain games, you know? So yeah, that was about it for the arcade version of Donkey Kong 3. So once again, we'll meet you guys back onto the forms of the NES Classic Mini and able to boot up Donkey Kong 3. So we'll meet you guys in just a second. Alright, here we are now onto the NES version of Donkey Kong 3, where, as far as I can tell, the entire gameplay of the NES version plays very identical to the arcade version, except the fact that, obviously though, as far as when Mario has stated this before, there's no death animation for the sake of if you get hit by the forms of not only certain pesky flies, but that's as far as I can usually think about this. So, and again, there's nothing else we can really say about this, apart from the fact that, unlike the forms of how it does it on not only Donkey Kong, but also with Donkey Kong Jr. as well, that basically, do you guys know about the fact that there was multiple versions of not only for Donkey Kong, but for Donkey Kong Jr. as well? However, for Donkey Kong 3 does have lesser amounts of versions compared to the forms of how it does it in the previous 2 games. So, for instance, about the fact that, obviously, like I mentioned this before, that this game did originally came out in 1983 for the arcade machines, so relatively speaking now, there's only a grand total of 3 versions this time around. Well, technically 4, if you want to count the forms of the e-reader accessory for the Game Boy Advance. So, relatively speaking now, we've already experienced the arcade version, and there's also the NES/Famicom version, as we're going to be jumping right into right now. And there's also the forms of the Game & Watch version, which only exists in Japan, as well as the American. And finally, most notably, e-reader for the Game Boy Advance accessory. So because of that though, yeah, nothing else I can really say about this. And relatively speaking though, it did a massive success in Japan. However, in joining forms of the American version, it was not so much successful, mainly due to the forms of 1983 video game crash. So because of that though, yeah, I can totally see why about the fact that this game is completely forgotten for most gamers out there. To be more specifically though, because anyone else seems able to recognize Donkey Kong as well as Donkey Kong Jr. But that's just mainly because everyone else did somehow experience those two games well enough, whilst compared to Donkey Kong 3, it is a very bizarre game after all. Although technically speaking of Mario, is that the only time we've actually heard about Stanley as a main playable character in this game was actually during the forms of in Super Smash Bros. Melee for one of those trophies you can able to obtain. So, for instance, there was that particular trophy that says Stanley, and as a result, it did mention Donkey Kong 3 as one of those gaming releases as well as gaming appearances during that specific time. So, yeah, that seems a little bit interesting. So, and as you can tell, once again, I'm doing pretty well on the NES version so far, and this is the third stage that we can now able to actually jump right into. So as you can see, that the entire platforms has now been designed a little bit differently or something like that, even though it's a bit difficult to tell, to able to describe about it. However, unlike the forms of how it does it on Donkey Kong as well as Donkey Kong Jr., that Donkey Kong 3 does not come with the forms of the NES Classic Mini pre-installed. So because of that though, what we attempt to do is that much like the forms of how it does it on not only DuckTales 1 and 2, but it's also with the forms of Super Mario Bros. 2, aka Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, that basically though we have to once again hack our the NES Classic Mini, just to ensure for the fact that we can able to actually add in some more titles into the forms of this beloved classic system, despite the fact that we have to deal with the forms of the very short lead for that particular NES controller, which is a bit of a bummer though to me though, but regardless of everything else though, it's just about the fact that we just want to show this off for the sake of the forms of trying to be playing through a whole bunch of Donkey Kong games, because as far as I'm aware, we did really enjoy those series after all. So because of that though, yeah, there goes my run for the sake of the forms of Donkey Kong 3. So with that being said, now it's your turn, Sonic, to able to actually go ahead and select, let me guess, Game B for the likes of Donkey Kong 3 for the NES version. So, to be expected at this point. So, yeah, let's see if I can able to be the fastest thing alive to able to actually spray Donkey Kong at all times, so without even trying to able to actually get hurt by not only those pesky flies, but it's also about the fact that something's worth noting for as well, that you don't want to let Donkey Kong go all the way to the bottom for that particular rope climbing, because as far as I'm aware, if you let him drop into the ground, you will get lose a life. So because of that though, yeah, that's as far as we can able to say about Donkey Kong 3. And I'll go say for this point, Sonic, is that we really do enjoy playing for those Donkey Kong arcade games, basically, because some of them are actually pretty cool. Like, for instance, we can able to experience every single stages, except the fact that, unfortunately, though, as it turns out, we ended up missing out on the third stage on the arcade version, but that's just mainly because, I will admit it though, this game is also very difficult, but I will admit it though right away, there's nothing else I can really speak about in terms of the forms of not only for the sake of today's discussion, but also with how Donkey Kong 3 actually plays out to be. So because of that though, I'm sure enough though, Mario, is about the fact that until tomorrow, that exponentially Piglet will definitely mention more topics during at some point until tomorrow, because as far as I'm aware is that today's date, of course, there is the 28th of April today, in some cases though in 2024 today. And actually speaking though, we've only got 3 more days to go until we are approaching on to May, which obviously means that yes indeed, that we'll be pretty excited about the forms of how May actually is going to turn out to be. So, I'm sure enough though, Sonic, is that I feel like that April for this year is alright. I mean, I could have able to actually see a lot of high expectations, like specifically like, oh I don't know, maybe they're trying to able to actually surprise us for, well, it's kind of hard to say, but either way though, that's as far as we can able to say about it. So, again, we really do apologize for our commentary about the forms of this particular video, because let's be honest here, there's nothing else I can really speak about. I mean, no matter what though, it was actually quite interesting to able to actually experience Donkey Kong 3, because believe it or not, this is the only Donkey Kong arcade game that we've never tackled through in the past. To be more specifically, trying to able to go alongside with the forms of some anniversary celebrations for our YouTube channel, and there goes my run, and let's just say the NES version of my run is pretty rough. So, to be expected, just like the forms of the other 2 games. So yeah, that's about it for Donkey Kong 3. Again, nothing else we can really say about it, so there, yeah, this is me, Sonic the Hedgehog here, and Mario here, And for now, we are basically done with the classic Donkey Kong games in the 1980s, basically. So, I suppose, next up in terms of the forms of our retrospective for playing Donkey Kong games, I believe next up we're about to be doing is Donkey Kong Country 2 for the Game Boy Advance to mark the 20th anniversary of that particular game's release on the Game Boy Advance. So stay tuned for that. So we shall definitely see what happens. So yeah, I will see you guys at some point soon. Yep, take care of yourselves and have a great one. See you guys then.